You don't fix a dead jet by staring at a screen, the old man said quietly, but no one was listening. The F-16 sat motionless on the tarmac, its sleek frame shimmering under the late afternoon heat. A machine built for speed and precision now reduced to silence, its canopy closed, its pilot waiting, hands resting on controls that answered nothing, while a ring of ground crew surrounded it like surgeons who had run out of answers, their laptops open, diagnostic cables snaking across the concrete, green indicators glowing with false confidence, as if the aircraft itself was lying to them. Ryan Cole kicked lightly at the landing gear, more out of frustration than force, the dull thud echoing against the empty hum of the runway as he shook his head and let out a dry laugh, the kind that carried just enough edge to cut. 6 million lines of code, and she just decides to quit, he muttered, glancing over his shoulder toward the small group of observers standing behind the safety line, his eyes settling on the one man who didn't belong. Eli Carter stood apart from the others, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn brown jacket that looked older than half the crew on site. His posture relaxed, almost indifferent, as if the urgency in the air couldn't reach him, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the flashing diagnostics or the restless technicians, but on the aircraft itself, studying it the way a mechanic studies an old engine by sound alone. Lieutenant Jason Reed followed Ryan's gaze and frowned, his crisp uniform catching the sunlight as he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep it professional, though the impatience still bled through. Who brought him here? Ryan smirked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag before tossing it onto a nearby toolbox. Command did, apparently. Said he might take a look. The words came out with a hint of disbelief, as if the idea itself was outdated, like trying to fix a modern fighter jet with a wrench from another era. Reed exhaled sharply, folding his arms as he approached Eli, the sound of his boots crunching lightly against the gravel-lined edge of the tarmac. Sir, this is a restricted maintenance zone, he said, the words sir carrying formality but no respect. We have certified avionics specialists handling the situation. Eli didn't respond immediately. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of jet fuel and heated asphalt, the distant hum of other aircraft rolling across adjacent runways blending into a low, constant backdrop. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm for the tension around him. She's not dead. Ryan let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he glanced at Reed. That's good to know, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, because everything we have says otherwise. Around them, screens continued to glow, numbers steady, systems normal, and yet the jet remained silent, stubborn, unmoved. Eli took a slow step forward, just enough to shift his angle toward the aircraft, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. And for a brief moment, the noise of the tarmac seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet weight of his presence pressing against the edge of a problem no one had solved yet. Ryan stepped closer to the jet, folding his arms as if proximity alone might force the machine to cooperate, the faint ticking of cooling metal echoing beneath the quiet tension that had settled over the crew. Not dead? He repeated, his voice sharper now, edged with the frustration of 6 hours of failed diagnostics. We have run every system check twice. Fuel flow is clean, ignition sequence is green, flight control surfaces respond, and yet she will not even try to turn over, he gestured toward the open laptops as if they were witnesses that could back him up. That is what dead looks like. Lieutenant Reed gave a short nod, his patience thinning. Sir, with respect, this aircraft operates on systems that require precise calibration and certified access. This is not something you can just listen to and guess. Eli did not react to the tone. He kept his eyes on the aircraft, not the people, not the screens, not the numbers that seemed to comfort everyone else, but on the stillness itself, the kind of stillness that did not belong on a machine built to roar across the sky at over 1,000 miles per hour. The wind shifted again, brushing against the fuselage, and for a brief second Eli tilted his head, as if catching something carried in that movement, something subtle, something off. She is not guessing, he said, quietly, more to himself than to them. She is trying to tell you something. Ryan let out a breath through his nose, shaking his head as he turned to Reed. This is exactly why we should not be pulling people out of retirement from modern systems, he said. lowering his voice but not enough to hide the irritation. This is not a story from decades ago. This is a real aircraft with real software. Around them, the ground crew shifted uneasily, some pretending to focus on their screens, others watching the exchange with the kind of curiosity that comes when something feels slightly out of place, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Inside the cockpit, the pilot adjusted his grip on the controls, his voice coming through the radio with a controlled calm that carried a hint of strain. "Ground. We are running out of time on this window." The words hung in the air, tightening everything. Reed straightened immediately, stepping aside to respond into his headset, but the pressure was already there, pressing down on every second that passed without an answer. Eli took another slow step forward, stopping just short of the safety boundary, his gaze tracing along the fuselage until it settled on a small section near the intake, a panel no one else had paid any attention to, perfectly aligned at first glance. Just another piece of precision engineering in a machine built from thousands of them. He narrowed his eyes slightly, the world around him fading into a low hum, the voices, the radios, the restless movement all receding as his focus locked onto that single detail, something about it sitting just a fraction out of place, not enough for a sensor to flag, not enough for a system to recognize, but enough for someone who had spent a lifetime around machines that did not always speak in numbers. "That panel," he said, lifting a finger just slightly, not commanding, not insisting, simply stating, "It is not sitting right." Ryan followed his gaze, squinting as he walked over and ran his hand along the surface, his fingers brushing across smooth metal that felt exactly as it should. "It is flush," he said quickly, almost immediately. "Torque specs are within range, seals are intact, diagnostics show no fault in that section." He straightened, giving Eli a look that mixed dismissal with a hint of disbelief. "There is nothing there." Eli did not move, his eyes still fixed on that same spot, his voice steady. "That is the problem." Ryan stared at him for a moment, then let out a quiet scoff, the kind that came from someone who had already made up his mind. "There is nothing wrong with that panel," he said, slower this time, as if repeating it would make it more true. "The system would flag it if there was." Lieutenant Reed stepped forward, his posture tightening as the situation drifted further from protocol. "Sir, we cannot start opening components based on intuition," he said firmly. "Every access point is logged, every seal is accounted for, and every unnecessary break in procedure creates risk we cannot afford right now." The pressure in his voice was not just authority, it was time, the ticking clock hanging over all of them like a weight that grew heavier with every passing second. Eli did not argue. He simply looked at the aircraft, then back at the panel, as if the conversation happening around him had already become irrelevant. "You are listening to what the system says," he said quietly, "but not to what the machine is doing." Ryan shook his head, running a hand through his hair, frustration rising again. "Machines do not say anything," he snapped. "They report data, and the data says everything is fine." Eli's gaze shifted slightly, finally meeting Ryan's eyes for the first time, and there was something in that look, not confrontation, not challenge, just a calm certainty that did not bend. "If everything was fine," he said, "you would not be standing here." The words landed heavier than they should have, cutting through the noise of logic and procedure with something simpler, something harder to dismiss. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The distant whine of another jet taking off rolled across the base, the sound rising and fading like a reminder of what this aircraft was supposed to do, but could not. Near the edge of the group, Airman Lucas Hale shifted his weight, his eyes moving between Eli and the jet, his brow slightly furrowed, as if trying to connect something he could not quite name. He had been watching since the beginning, quiet, unnoticed, but something about the way the old man spoke did not feel like guessing. It felt like remembering. Ryan broke the silence with a sharp exhale, turning back toward the panel and placing his hand against it again, pressing slightly as if proving a point. "It is solid," he said, louder now. "There is no movement, no gap, no deviation." Eli did not move closer, did not reach out, did not insist. He simply spoke, his voice low but steady. "Then open it." Reed's head snapped toward him immediately. "That is not happening," he said, the firmness returning. "We do not break a factory seal without a confirmed fault." Eli nodded once, as if he had expected that answer, and for the first time, he took a small step back, his hands returning to his jacket pockets, his posture relaxing again. Then she stays quiet. The simplicity of it hung in the air, heavier than any argument. Ryan turned, ready to respond, but the words caught somewhere between frustration and doubt. Behind them, Lucas felt something shift, not in the aircraft, but in the moment itself, a subtle sense that they were standing on the edge of a decision that would matter more than any of them realized. His eyes drifted back to the panel, then to Eli, and then to the aircraft as a whole, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he felt a quiet certainty begin to form, the kind that does not come from data or orders, but from recognizing when someone is seeing something everyone else has missed. Lucas swallowed quietly, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his tablet as he watched Eli step back, the older man's silence somehow louder than everything that had been said, and for a moment the entire scene felt suspended, like the air itself was waiting for someone to decide what mattered more, procedure or instinct. The radio crackled again from the cockpit, the pilot's voice more urgent now, still controlled but carrying a sharper edge. Ground. We are approaching the limit on this window. Request status update. Lieutenant Reed turned immediately, responding with practiced precision, but even as he spoke, his eyes flicked back toward the aircraft, toward that same panel, and for the first time there was hesitation, small but undeniable. Ryan paced a few steps, dragging a hand across his face before stopping again in front of the jet, his confidence starting to fracture under the weight of time. We are not opening that panel, he said, though now it sounded less like certainty and more like a decision he was trying to hold on to. There is no fault code, no pressure drop, nothing. Eli remained where he was, unmoving, his gaze still locked on the aircraft as if the rest of them had already stepped out of the equation. Then you are fixing numbers, he said quietly, not the machine. The words settled into the space between them, and Lucas felt it again, that same quiet shift, like a line being drawn that only a few people could see. He glanced down at his tablet, then back at the panel, replaying the last hour in his mind, every check, every readout, every confident conclusion that had led them nowhere. Something about it did not sit right, not because the data was wrong, but because it was too perfect. He had seen systems fail before, and they never failed clean. There was always something, a flicker, a warning, a hint. This had nothing, just silence. His heart began to beat a little faster as a thought formed, not fully clear, but strong enough to push him forward. Lieutenant, Lucas said carefully, stepping closer, his voice respectful but firm enough to be heard. What if the system is not seeing the problem because the problem is mechanical, not digital? Reed looked at him, surprised by the interruption. Everything on this aircraft is integrated, he replied, though slower now. If there was a mechanical fault, we would see a downstream effect. Lucas nodded slightly, but his eyes moved back to Eli. Unless it is something small enough that it does not trigger a system response, he said, choosing each word with care, something that does not break the system, just prevents it from starting. Ryan turned toward him, a hint of irritation returning. You are suggesting we override protocol based on a guess? Lucas hesitated for a fraction of a second, then shook his head. No, sir. I am suggesting we might be missing something, because we are only looking where the system tells us to look. The statement hung there, fragile but real, and for the first time, the certainty in the group cracked open just enough to let doubt in. Reed exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting from Lucas to Eli, then back to the aircraft, weighing something. He had not expected to weigh today. The radio crackled again, louder this time, the pilot's voice cutting through the moment. Ground, I need an answer. The pressure surged back instantly, filling every gap hesitation had created. Ryan looked at Reed, waiting. The crew around them went still, their movements slowing, their attention narrowing. And Eli, still standing a few feet away, said nothing at all, as if the decision had never been his to make. Lieutenant Reed did not answer right away, his jaw tightening as the weight of the moment pressed in from all sides. The ticking clock, the waiting pilot, the silent aircraft, and now the quiet challenge that hung in the air not from Eli, but from one of his own men, and for the first time since the situation began, the certainty he had been holding on to felt incomplete. He turned his head slightly, looking again at the panel, then at the flawless stream of data glowing on the screens, and then back to Eli, who stood still as ever, not pushing, not insisting, just waiting in a way that suggested he had seen this moment before. Ryan shifted impatiently, breaking the silence with a sharper tone. "Lieutenant, we do not have time for this," he said, gesturing toward the aircraft. "We either stick to protocol or we shut it down and report a failure. Those are the options." Reed exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavy, and then he looked at Lucas again, studying him for a second longer than expected, as if trying to measure whether what he had just heard was doubt or insight. Around them, the crew had gone still, their earlier movements replaced by quiet attention, every eye drifting between the officer, the technician, and the old man who had not moved an inch. The radio crackled once more, sharper now. "Ground. I need a go or no go. We are out of buffer." The words landed hard, stripping away the last of the hesitation and forcing the moment into a decision. Reed closed his eyes for the briefest second, then opened them again, his voice firm but different now, less rigid, more deliberate. "Open the panel." Ryan froze, just for a fraction of a second, as if the order had not fully registered. "Sir?" Reed did not raise his voice, but the authority in it sharpened. "That is an order. Open it." The words cut clean through the tension, and suddenly everything moved again, but slower, more careful, like the entire team had stepped onto uncertain ground. Ryan hesitated only a moment longer before turning back to the aircraft, signaling to one of the crew members, "Get me the tools." The technician rushed forward, handing over a kit, the metallic clink of instruments sounding louder than it should in the quiet that had settled over the tarmac. Ryan crouched beside the panel, his movements precise, practiced, but now carrying a trace of something new, not doubt exactly, but awareness, as if he could feel the eyes on him, not just from the crew, but from the decision itself. Eli watched without moving, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, but there was something beneath it now, something almost like recognition, as if a door had just been opened that could not be closed again. Lucas stood just behind Reed, his heartbeat steadying slightly, though the tension had not left him, it had only shifted, now focused entirely on what would happen next. The first bolt loosened with a quiet turn, then another, the sound crisp against the backdrop of distant engines and wind, each movement pulling them further away from protocol and closer to something none of them could fully predict. Ryan paused for a brief second before lifting the panel, his hand resting on the edge as if weighing the moment. Then he pulled it free. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Ryan leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked inside, and the confidence that had defined him since the beginning flickered, just for an instant, replaced by something far more dangerous, the realization that what he was seeing did not match what the system had told him at all. Ryan did not speak right away, and that alone was enough to change the atmosphere. His usual quick confidence replaced by a stillness that drew every eye toward the open panel, his head tilted slightly as he leaned closer, his fingers brushing carefully along the inner edge, as if confirming what he was seeing was real and not some trick of light or shadow. Lieutenant Reed stepped forward, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with urgency. "What is it?" Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound almost unsteady. There is a microseal here," he said, pointing inside. "It is slightly warped, barely visible, but it is enough to disrupt the airflow sensor alignment." He paused, shaking his head as if trying to reconcile it. The system would not flag this. It is too small, too localized. The words landed like a quiet admission, not just of a fault in the machine, but of a gap in everything they had trusted up to this point. Around them, the crew leaned in slightly, their earlier certainty replaced by focused attention, the kind that comes when something unexpected breaks through a wall of assumptions. Eli took a single step forward now, just enough to close part of the distance, his eyes moving past Ryan and into the open panel, and for the first time, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small worn leather pouch, its surface creased and softened by years of use, the snap opening with a faint click that seemed louder than it should in the quiet. Lucas watched closely, his breath slowing, his earlier instinct now sharpening into something clearer, something grounded. Eli did not rush. He reached into the pouch and withdrew a simple tool, small, unpolished, the the kind of instrument that did not belong next to advanced diagnostic equipment, yet carried a weight of familiarity that none of the sleek tools around them could match. Ryan glanced at it briefly, then back at Eli, and for once, there was no sarcasm, only a question forming without words. "Do not force it," Eli said calmly, his voice steady as he knelt beside the open panel. "It is not broken. It is misaligned." Reed said nothing, but he did not stop him. That alone shifted everything. Eli leaned in, his movements precise but unhurried, his fingers steady as he positioned the tool against the small warped edge, adjusting it with a subtle pressure that looked almost insignificant, a correction so small it could have been dismissed if not for the way every person there was now watching it happen. The world seemed to narrow to that single motion, the faint sound of metal settling into place, the slight change in resistance as the seal aligned properly. And then Eli pulled the tool back, pausing for a brief moment as if listening again, not to the people, not to the radio, but to the aircraft itself. He closed the panel gently, securing it without ceremony, then stood, stepping back into the same quiet space he had occupied from the beginning. "Try it now," he said. Ryan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before signaling to the crew, his voice carrying a different tone now, stripped of arrogance, replaced by something closer to respect. "Run the start sequence." The pilot's voice came through the radio, ready, focused, copy. A heartbeat passed, then another, and then the engine turned, not loudly at first, but with a low, steady hum that grew, building into the unmistakable sound of life returning, the kind of sound that filled the tarmac and pushed everything else aside. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply stood there, watching, as the machine that had been silent came back to life. And in that moment, the absence of words said more than anything they could have said at all. The engine's steady roar filled the air, rising from a low hum into a controlled, powerful vibration that spread across the tarmac, pushing heat and sound outward in a way that felt almost physical. And for a long moment, no one moved, as if breaking that silence would somehow undo what had just happened. Ryan stood frozen beside the aircraft, his eyes fixed on the intake, his mind still trying to reconcile the simplicity of what he had just seen with the complexity of everything he had believed, the data, the systems, the certainty that had carried him through years of training, now standing quietly behind a truth he had not expected to face. Lieutenant Reed lowered his headset slowly, the pilot's voice still coming through with confirmation, stable readings, systems responding, everything exactly as it should have been from the beginning, and yet it had taken something none of them had considered to get there. Lucas exhaled softly, not even realizing he had been holding his breath, his gaze shifting from the aircraft to Eli, who had already stepped back again, his hands returning to his jacket pockets as if nothing significant had happened at all. There was no pride in his posture, no expectation of acknowledgement, just the same quiet presence he had carried from the moment he arrived. The radio crackled once more, the pilot's tone now steady, almost relieved. "Ground, systems are green across the board. Requesting clearance." Reed blinked once, then responded automatically, his voice returning to form, but something in it had changed, something quieter, more measured, cleared. The jet responded instantly, the engine building with purpose now, no hesitation, no resistance, just smooth, controlled power as it prepared to move. Ryan took a slow step back, his hand dropping from the panel, his fingers flexing slightly, as if still feeling the absence of resistance that had been there moments ago, and then he turned, not toward the aircraft, but toward Eli. For a second, he did not speak. The words were there, somewhere, but they did not come easily, not in the way they usually did. "How did you know?" he finally asked, his voice lower, stripped of the edge it had carried before. Eli did not look at him right away. His gaze followed the aircraft as it began to roll forward, the sound of its movement blending into the rhythm of the bass, and only after a moment did he answer, "She told me." Ryan frowned slightly, not dismissing it this time, but not fully understanding it either, and before he could ask more, a new sound cut through the air, sharp and distinct, the distant approach of a vehicle moving faster than anything else on the service road. Heads turned almost instinctively as a black staff vehicle came into view, its tires crunching against the gravel as it closed the distance quickly, purposeful, direct. It did not slow until it reached the edge of the tarmac, stopping with a precision that matched the urgency in its arrival. The door opened immediately, and a tall figure stepped out, his uniform crisp, his presence carrying a weight that shifted the atmosphere the moment his boots touched the ground. Conversations died before they could begin, movements slowed, and without a single command being spoken, the energy of the entire scene changed. General Robert Hayes did not look at the aircraft first. He looked straight at Eli. General Hayes walked forward without hesitation, each step measured, deliberate, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood, and as he moved, the air around him seemed to shift, conversations fading into silence, posture straightening instinctively, the unspoken discipline of the base snapping into place. Lieutenant Reed came to attention immediately, his voice sharp, "Sir." But the general did not acknowledge him. Not yet, his focus locked entirely on Eli. Ryan followed a half step behind, unsure whether to stand still or step aside. The earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet awareness that something far bigger than a maintenance issue was unfolding in front of him. Eli did not move. He stood exactly as he had before, hands in his jacket pockets, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, as if the arrival of a four-star general was no more significant than the hum of the engine behind them. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The sound of the aircraft idling filled the space, a steady reminder of what had just been accomplished. And then General Hayes stopped just a few feet in front of Eli. He studied him closely, not quickly, not casually, but with the kind of attention reserved for something that carried history, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if confirming what he already knew. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried weight. "You took your time getting here." It was not a question. It was familiarity. Ryan's head lifted slightly, confusion flickering across his face as he glanced between them. Eli gave the smallest nod. "Traffic," he said simply. The corner of the general's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close to it, something that did not belong to rank or protocol, but to memory. Around them, the crew stood frozen, the meaning of the exchange settling in slowly, like a realization arriving piece by piece. Reed remained at attention, but his eyes shifted briefly, the rigidity of his posture now paired with a growing understanding that the man standing in front of him was not who he had assumed him to be. General Hayes took one more step forward, closing the distance, and then, without ceremony, without hesitation, he raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate motion. The salute was sharp, precise, and absolute. It landed in the silence like a shockwave. No one had expected it. Not Ryan, not Reed, not the crew, not even Lucas, whose breath caught for just a second as the moment locked into place. A four-star general, standing on an active tarmac, saluting a man in a worn jacket with no visible rank, no insignia, no recognition except the one that mattered. Eli held his gaze for a brief moment, then returned the salute, just as precise, just as controlled. The movement carried not by habit, but by something deeper, something that had been earned long before anyone here had ever seen him. When their hands lowered, the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. General Hayes turned slightly then, his voice carrying just enough for those closest to hear. "There is not a pilot on this base who has not flown because of him," he said, not loudly, not for effect, but as a simple statement of fact. Ryan felt the words settle into him, reshaping everything he thought he understood, his earlier skepticism dissolving into something quieter, something more grounded. Lucas stood still, his earlier instinct now fully realized, the sense that he had been witnessing something rare, something that did not happen often, but when it did, it changed the way people saw the world. And Eli, as the weight of the moment spread across the tarmac, said nothing at all. The silence did not break right away. It settled, heavy and deliberate, stretching across the tarmac as the engine continued its steady rhythm in the background, no longer the center of attention, but a quiet confirmation of something much larger that had just unfolded. Ryan stood where he was, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer rigid, his eyes fixed not on the aircraft, but on Eli, as if seeing him clearly for the first time, the layers of assumption stripped away one by one. Lieutenant Reed slowly lowered his hand from his salute, his stance still formal, but the certainty behind it now grounded in understanding rather than protocol. His earlier authority reshaped into something quieter, something earned in the space of a few minutes. Around them, the crew remained still, no one rushing back to their tasks, no one speaking, because whatever had just happened did not feel like something to move past quickly. It felt like something to absorb. General Hayes took a step back, his gaze still on Eli, the weight of history lingering in the space between them. Then he gave a small nod, not as a command, not as a dismissal, but as acknowledgement, the kind that carried respect without needing explanation. Eli returned the nod just as simply, his expression unchanged, and then, without ceremony, without waiting for anything more, he turned slightly, as if the moment had already ended for him the second the aircraft came back to life. Lucas watched him closely, a quiet realization settling in his chest, the understanding that some people did not stay for recognition because they had never needed it in the first place. Ryan took a step forward, almost without thinking. "Sir," he said, the word different now. No sarcasm, no edge, just respect. We should log what you did, for the system, for the record." Eli paused for a brief moment, his back still partially turned. Then he glanced over his shoulder, his voice calm, steady, and final. "It will not help your system." Ryan hesitated, the answer not what he expected, but somehow exactly what he needed to hear. Eli's gaze shifted briefly toward the aircraft, then back to Ryan. "You have good tools," he said. "Just do not forget to look past them." The words were simple, but they settled deeper than anything else that had been said that day. Reed stood quietly, absorbing it. Lucas felt it lock into place, and even the crew, though they said nothing, carried it with them in the way they looked at the machine, no longer just as data, but as something that required more than numbers to understand. The engine noise began to fade as the aircraft moved farther down the runway, its purpose restored, its silence replaced by motion, and as it disappeared into the distance, the tension that had defined the moment slowly released, leaving behind something steadier, something quieter. Eli adjusted his jacket slightly, then began to walk away, unhurried, unnoticed by most, but not by those who mattered in that moment. No one stopped him. No one called after him. They simply watched as he moved across the edge of the tarmac, his figure blending into the ordinary world as if that was where he had always belonged. And in the space he left behind, there was no applause, no celebration, just a shared understanding that respect was not something you asked for, and it was not something you displayed. It was something that revealed itself, quietly, when it mattered most.